My name is Edward William Harper, though in my youth most people simply called me Edward. I was born on the 3rd of September in the year 1833 in a small township just outside Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where the fields stretched farther than a boy's imagination and the nights were so quiet that one could hear the wind long before it arrived. I am now in my 87th year, and I have lived long enough to witness wonders that would have been dismissed as fantasy in my childhood. Iron horses that move without animals, voices traveling across wires, streets glowing with artificial suns after dusk. And yet, for all the progress I have seen, there remains one matter from my youth that has never advanced, never softened, never found resolution. There is a secret my father carried to his grave, a truth he guarded more fiercely than his own comfort, and when he died, he took it with him, leaving me with nothing but fragments, suspicions, and a lifetime of unanswered questions. My father, Samuel Harper, was a man of measured words and deliberate movements. He was not unkind, nor was he cold, but there was always a distance about him, as though a part of his mind resided in a place the rest of us could not enter. He worked as a carpenter, known in our township for crafting doors and cabinets that lasted longer than the houses they belonged to. People respected him, though few could claim to truly know him. Even my mother, who shared his table and his bed for more than 20 years, often remarked that he carried silence like another man might carry a coat, always with him, always within reach. Our home was modest, built of timber he had shaped himself. It stood near a narrow creek where I spent much of my boyhood skipping stones and imagining distant lands I had only read about in borrowed books. We were neither poor nor prosperous. We lived as most families did in those days, by the rhythm of seasons and the mercy of harvests. I had 2 younger sisters, Mary and Ellen, both lively and curious, and a mother whose laughter once filled the house so completely that I believed it could never fade. In those early years my life seemed ordinary, even fortunate. Yet even in childhood I sensed that my father bore a burden unseen. There were nights when he would sit alone at the kitchen table long after the candles had burned low, staring not at any object but into the empty space before him, as if reading words only he could see. When I asked what troubled him, he would place a heavy hand on my shoulder and tell me that some thoughts were not meant for young minds. At the time, I accepted this as adults often expect children to accept things, without understanding, without protest. But curiosity, once awakened, rarely returns to sleep. I remember one winter evening particularly well. Snow had fallen so thickly that the world outside seemed erased, and the only sound was the crackling of the hearth. My sisters had gone to bed, and my mother was mending a dress by candlelight. My father entered from the cold, brushed the snow from his coat, and placed a small wooden box upon the highest shelf in the room. It was not large, no bigger than a loaf of bread, but he handled it with a care I had never seen him give to any other object. When he noticed my eyes upon it, he offered no explanation. He simply turned away and said that I should prepare for bed. From that night forward I was aware of the box. It became a silent presence in the house, never discussed, never moved in daylight, yet always there. As the eldest child, I often rose earlier than the others to assist with chores. In those quiet dawn hours, I would sometimes see my father standing near that shelf, his back to the room, his shoulders rigid as though bracing against an unseen force. Once I heard him whisper something I could not make out. Another time I saw him press his hand against the box as if it contained not wood and metal, but memory itself. My childhood was filled with the ordinary labors of the era, hauling water from the well, chopping kindling, tending a small vegetable patch behind the house. We attended church each Sunday, and I received what schooling the township could provide, which was limited but sufficient to teach me reading and arithmetic. To any passerby, we were a respectable family, living a respectable life. No scandal attached itself to our name, no rumor lingered at the edges of conversation. And yet, beneath that appearance of normalcy, there existed an undercurrent of unease that I could not then define. Children are perceptive in ways adults often forget. We noticed pauses in conversation, glances exchanged, doors closed more quickly than necessary. I did not know what my father hid, but I knew he hid something. It was not merely secrecy. It was vigilance. The kind of vigilance one maintains not over valuables but over truths that could alter how one is seen or how one sees oneself. I did not understand it then. I believed, as boys do, that time would eventually reveal everything. But I would learn, much later and at great cost, that time does not always uncover truth. Sometimes it buries it deeper, until all that remains are echoes and the faint outline of a question that follows a man for the rest of his life. As I grew older, my awareness of my father's peculiarities did not fade, as I had once expected it might. Instead, it sharpened, much like a blade honed quietly over time. By the age of 15, I had come to understand that what I had once dismissed as mere solemn temperament was, in truth, something more deliberate. My father was not simply reserved. He was guarded. And a guarded man, I would later learn, is often guarding more than his words. Samuel Harper rose before dawn each morning, long before the rooster announced the day. I would often hear his footsteps moving across the wooden floorboards while the rest of the household remained asleep. There was a precision to his routine that bordered on ritual. He would light the stove, boil water, and sit alone with his cup for several minutes without drinking it, staring into the steam as though it carried messages meant only for him. Then he would leave for his workshop behind the house, where the steady rhythm of hammer against nail would soon follow. To the township, he was a dependable craftsman. To us, he was a reliable provider. But to himself, I suspected, he was a man at odds with memory. There were small habits that drew my attention. He kept his coat pockets unusually heavy, though he seldom spent money. He walked the perimeter of our property each evening, even in harsh weather, as if inspecting invisible boundaries. And there were nights when a distant knock at the door would stiffen his posture before he even rose to answer it. Most visitors were ordinary, neighbors seeking repairs or exchanging news, yet he always seemed relieved when they departed, as though danger had passed rather than conversation concluded. The wooden box remained untouched in daylight. It became, for me, the symbol of everything I did not know. Once during the summer of 1849, curiosity overcame caution. My parents had gone to visit an ailing relative several miles away, and I was left at home with my sisters. While they played outside, I dragged a chair beneath the shelf and lifted the box down with trembling hands. It was locked, as I had expected, with a small brass latch no larger than my thumb. I shook it gently and heard the faint shifting of papers or perhaps metal within. There was no rattle of coins, no clink of tools, only a muted slide, like letters brushing against one another. I returned it to its place before anyone noticed. But from that day forward, the mystery had weight. My mother, though less observant than I in some respects, was not entirely blind to my father's inwardness. I recall overhearing a conversation between them late one evening when they believed us children asleep. She asked him, in a voice edged with fatigue rather than anger, why he insisted on keeping those old things. He responded quietly, too quietly for me to discern the words, but his tone carried finality. The matter was not open to discussion. My mother sighed in a way that suggested resignation more than agreement. It was then I realized that whatever my father guarded did not concern only himself. It touched the household, even if indirectly. In the early 1850s, our township changed as the nation itself shifted. Rail lines crept closer, bringing strangers whose accents revealed distant origins. News of political tensions and territorial disputes filtered in through newspapers passed from hand to hand. My father read those papers with an intensity I had not seen him give to anything else. Certain headlines would cause him to fold the pages abruptly and set them aside, his jaw tightening as though he had tasted something bitter. One autumn afternoon, a man arrived on horseback wearing a dark coat despite the mild weather. He asked specifically for my father, refusing water and declining to sit. They spoke outside, their voices low but urgent. I watched from the window, noticing how my father's shoulders stiffened much like they did when he faced that wooden box. The visitor stayed no more than 10 minutes. When he left, my father stood in the yard for a long while, staring down the road until the rider disappeared entirely from view. That evening, the box was moved. For the first time in my life, it was no longer on the shelf. I found it later beneath his workbench in the workshop, concealed behind a stack of lumber. He must have believed it safer there, though from what danger I could not guess. I remember feeling an odd mixture of triumph and dread, triumph at having located it, dread at what its relocation implied. Secrets, I realized, were not static things. They reacted to the world around them. They shifted when threatened. As my adolescence gave way to early manhood, my relationship with my father grew more complex. We worked side by side shaping beams and fitting joints, and in those hours he seemed almost at ease. He would occasionally tell stories of his youth, fragments of travel, brief mentions of towns whose names I did not recognize. Yet whenever I asked direct questions about certain years of his life, particularly the period before he married my mother, he would grow vague, redirecting the conversation to safer subjects. It was not hostility. It was evasion practiced so often it had become instinct. I began to suspect that my father had once lived a life entirely separate from the one we knew, a chapter deliberately sealed away. The wooden box, the late-night silences, the anxious glances at unfamiliar faces, all of it pointed toward something unfinished, something unresolved. And like all unfinished matters, it cast a shadow longer than the object itself. I did not yet know what truth lay hidden, nor how deeply it would one day affect me. But by then, I understood one certainty with absolute clarity. My father was not merely a quiet man. He was a man protecting a story he never intended to tell. The year my father fell ill was the year I turned 26, and by then I had convinced myself that whatever secret he guarded would eventually lose its power. I believed time weakened all things, memories, fears, even truths. I was wrong. Time does not always erode a secret. Sometimes it fortifies it, sealing it so tightly that even death cannot pry it open. My father's illness came without warning. One morning he rose as he always had, lit the stove, and stepped outside to the workshop. By midday he returned pale and unsteady, his hands trembling in a way I had never seen. He dismissed it as fatigue, yet the following day he could scarcely stand without assistance. Within a fortnight he was confined to his bed, the strength that had once shaped timber and iron reduced to a frail grip upon the blanket. The doctor from the nearest town visited twice, offering tonics and cautious assurances, but I saw in his eyes what his words avoided. My father was not recovering. He was declining, and he knew it as surely as I did. It was during those weeks, as the inevitability of his passing settled upon the household like a heavy fog, that the question I had carried since boyhood grew impossible to ignore. The wooden box reappeared beside his bedside table. He kept one hand resting upon it almost constantly, as if fearing it might vanish if he did not. I remember the evening I finally gathered the courage to ask him. The room was dim, lit only by a single candle whose flame wavered with every draught. My mother had gone to prepare supper, and my sisters were occupied elsewhere. For the first time in my life, I found myself alone with him in silence that demanded speech rather than discouraged it. "Father," I said, my voice sounding strangely distant to my own ears, "there is something you have carried for many years, something you have never spoken of. I have seen it, in that box, in your eyes. I only wish to understand." He looked at me then with an expression I had never before witnessed. Not anger, not fear, but a profound weariness, as though he had been awaiting that question for decades and dreaded its arrival all the same. His fingers tightened slightly upon the box. For a moment, I thought he would refuse me as he had always done. Instead, he exhaled slowly and motioned for me to sit. "There are truths," he said at last, his voice thin but steady, "that do not belong to the living. They belong to the past, and the past is not always meant to be disturbed. It was not an answer. It was a wall disguised as wisdom." I pressed further, though gently. I spoke of my childhood curiosity, of the nights I had seen him staring into nothing, of the visitor on horseback years before. I told him I did not seek to judge, only to know. He listened without interruption, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the ceiling. When I finished, he closed his eyes for a long while, and I believed, truly believed, that he would finally speak plainly. Instead, he opened the box. Inside were letters, dozens of them, bound with a faded ribbon. Beneath them lay a small silver locket, tarnished by time. He lifted the letters with trembling hands, then hesitated. The candlelight flickered across his face, revealing a conflict that seemed to age him further in mere seconds. Finally, he set them back down without unfolding a single page. "I made a choice," he said quietly, "a choice that spared one life and altered another. Some decisions cannot be undone, and some truths cannot be told without causing harm that echoes longer than silence ever could." I felt frustration rise within me, sharp and immediate. His words hinted at confession yet withheld clarity. They were fragments of a story deliberately broken before it could form. I asked him what life had been spared, whose had been altered, and why such a burden had followed him into old age. He did not answer. Instead, he closed the box and turned his face toward the wall. That night I did something I had never done before. I disobeyed him. While he slept, I opened the box myself. My hands shook so violently that I nearly dropped the latch. The letters were written in a woman's hand, elegant, deliberate strokes unlike any I had seen from my mother or sisters. The ink had faded, but the emotion within the words had not. They spoke of promises made, of departures forced by circumstance, of a child whose name was never fully written. Each letter ended the same way: "Remember what you chose." The locket contained a small portrait, worn at the edges. A young woman gazed outward, her expression neither smiling nor sorrowful, merely resolute. I did not recognize her, yet her presence felt intimately connected to the man sleeping only a few feet away. The implication struck me with a force that left me breathless. My father had once lived another life, one entangled with decisions he had buried beneath years of routine and silence. I returned everything exactly as I had found it. But the knowledge could not be returned. The next morning, I confronted him again, this time with the certainty that I was no longer imagining shadows. He did not ask how I knew. He did not demand that I explain. He simply looked at me with eyes filled not with anger, but with sorrow, a sorrow so deep it silenced my accusations before they fully formed. "You were not meant to carry this," he whispered. It was mine to bear. Within 3 days, he was gone. He closed his eyes one final time, his hand resting upon the box, and whatever truth lay fully formed in his mind vanished with him. The letters remained. The portrait remained. But the story, the complete, undeniable truth, died in that room. Rumors circulated in the township for years afterward, vague suggestions of a past engagement, of a child lost or perhaps hidden. None could be confirmed. None could be denied. I had fragments, but not the whole. And fragments are often heavier than truth itself. From that day forward, the secret ceased to be my father's burden and became my inheritance. Not because I wished it, but because unanswered questions have a way of attaching themselves to those who seek them. I had opened the box expecting clarity. Instead, I had opened a lifetime of wondering, a question without an answer, a story without its ending. He closed his eyes, and with them, the truth closed forever. In the years that followed my father's passing, the house grew quieter than I had ever known it to be. Silence no longer felt like peace, it felt like an unfinished sentence hanging in the air. The wooden box remained where he had last placed it, yet I found myself unable to open it again for a long while. It was not fear that stopped me, it was understanding. I had already taken what I was never meant to take, and it had not brought me clarity. It had only given me weight. Time, however, has a peculiar way of softening even the heaviest burdens. Seasons changed, responsibilities multiplied, and life demanded my attention in ways that left little room for unanswered questions. I married, raised children, tended the land, and watched the world transform in ways my father could scarcely have imagined. Railways stretched across the countryside, lamps replaced candles, and voices traveled distances that once required weeks of travel. Progress arrived steadily, yet the past remained unmoved within me. It was not until I reached the age my father had been when I first noticed the box that I truly understood him. Age grants a perspective youth cannot possess. There are decisions one makes in the urgency of the moment, believing they are temporary, only to discover they become permanent companions. I realized then that whatever choice he had made was not simply a mistake or a betrayal, it was a crossroads from which no path led back to innocence. One evening, many decades later, I opened the box again. The letters were more fragile than before, their edges brittle, their ink fading into near invisibility. The portrait inside the locket had worn thin, as if even memory itself were eroding. I read the words slowly, no longer searching for revelation, but for understanding. I began to see not a scandal or a mystery, but a young man faced with a decision he believed necessary at the time. A decision that shaped the rest of his days, and in that moment, something within me shifted. I no longer wished to know the full truth. There is a peculiar freedom in accepting that not every question deserves an answer. Some truths, when uncovered, do not heal. They reopen wounds long scarred. My father had not remained silent out of cruelty or indifference. He had remained silent out of protection, perhaps for himself, perhaps for others, perhaps for a future he hoped would remain untouched by his past. Silence, I realized, can be an act of mercy just as much as confession can be an act of courage. I chose then to close the box for the final time. My children never asked about it. They saw it as an old keepsake, nothing more. I considered telling them, considered passing along the fragments I possessed, but each time I felt the same hesitation my father must have felt. I understood at last that inheritance is not only land or wealth, it is also the decision of what burdens to pass forward and what burdens to lay to rest. The secret did not vanish with my acceptance of it, but it ceased to control me. In old age, one begins to measure life not by achievements, but by the weight of regrets and the lightness of forgiveness. I forgave my father, though he had never asked for forgiveness. I forgave myself for opening the box when I should not have. And perhaps most importantly, I forgave the unknown, that vast space where answers never arrive, yet peace can still be found. When I sit by the window now, watching the sun sink below fields that have witnessed generations before me, I realize that every family carries stories untold. Some are hidden out of shame, others out of love, and many simply because words fail to capture the complexity of a single human choice. My father's secret was not unique in its existence, only in its intimacy. If there is one lesson I have learned across these many decades, it is this: not all mysteries are meant to be solved. Some are meant to be understood without being fully known. And perhaps that is enough. The box remains closed, resting quietly as it once did beside his bed. It no longer calls to me. It no longer demands answers. It is merely an object now, a symbol of the lives we live before we become memories ourselves. We are all, in the end, collections of choices, some spoken, some silent, some carried to the grave. If this story has stirred a memory within you, of a question unanswered, a letter unopened, or a silence that lingered too long, then hold it gently. Share these stories, preserve them, for voices fade faster than we expect. And should you find value in tales such as this, remain a while longer, for there are many more echoes of the past still waiting to be heard.